John-Manuel Andriote was a graduate journalism student at Northwestern University in 1985. That year, hysteria about AIDS was boiling over in the U.S. after actor Rock Hudson announced his own diagnosis. AIDS hit home for the 26-year-old Andriote when he learned that two of his friends, both in their 20s, one in New York, the other in Boston, had died from AIDS. Unfortunately, they were only the first of many friends and colleagues Andriote would lose in the years ahead. While doing an internship in Washington, D.C. in late 1985, Andriote met Bill Bailey. Bailey talked about his work as a volunteer buddy with D.C.'s Whitman Walker Clinic. He later became a prominent Washington lobbyist on AIDS prevention. Bailey encouraged Andriote to use his skills as a journalist to write about the growing AIDS epidemic. AIDS was already being described then as the greatest health threat of our time.
I realized as a journalist and as somebody who's interested in the world around him that AIDS really was going to be an important part of my life and of the latter part of this century. And so it would be a major challenge as a journalist to be a part of this. But also, as a gay man, I was very affected as I started losing friends of my own to the epidemic and seeing the effects of AIDS in the gay community and how it stirred up so much fear and hatred and divisiveness in this country.
Bill Bailey died from AIDS in April 1994. Soon afterward, Andriote felt he had seen and reported enough on AIDS to write a book about it. He traveled across the country interviewing hundreds of men and women on the front lines of the epidemic. Their stories of struggle, pain, loss, love, joy, and determination became the heart of Victory Deferred.
Well, Victory Deferred, How AIDS Changed Gay Life in America, was published in 1999 by the University of Chicago Press. It's a story of how this deadly epidemic affected a group of Americans in the early 80s, and how those people, gay men largely, their friends and neighbors, co-workers, and families pulled together to create a response to the epidemic by caring for people with the disease, by setting up prevention programs to prevent other people from becoming infected with HIV, to lobby the government for changes in things like the drug approval process, and for money for care and services for people with AIDS. And Victory Deferred tells the story of that response, which is essentially the world's earliest response to the epidemic as AIDS first affected gay men in the United States.
Victory Deferred is the story of how AIDS destroyed so many lives and transformed the lives of so many others. It is the story of how an army of lovers fought for the right to life and justice for people with AIDS and brought about profound change in some of the nation's most powerful institutions. Kirkus Reviews called it the most important AIDS chronicle since Randy Schultz and the band played on. The Washington Post said, Andriote has interviewed every major player during his nearly 2 decades of reporting on AIDS as a journalist, and it shows. The Los Angeles Times said, people who want to know how a community mobilized in the face of an unprecedented crisis will want to start here. Despite his focus on AIDS, a New York book editor asked Andriote to look at the history behind a late 1990s fad of platform shoes, flared jeans, and the 1970s disco dance music. The result was Hot Stuff.
It was published this year, 2001, by HarperCollins, and it's a brief history of disco. It talks about how this fun music, this music that was about good times and celebrating life, took off at the time it did in the 70s because it really was what people needed in that hard decade to give them an escape from the stresses of their lives and to remind them to celebrate the good times of their lives.
Is this book about music primarily, or is it more of a portrait of the time?
Well, it's really a cultural history, you know, of how this particular style of music music, which was largely African American music, how this music took off at the time it did because it was what people needed. The same way during the Great Depression, African American jazz musicians speeded up jazz music and created faster dance styles. So part of my argument, I guess, in the book is that during troubled times, people need and enjoy faster styles of music. It gives them a physical catharsis and an escape from the stresses of their lives. So it's a cultural history. It's a serious book on a fun subject, is how my editor described it.
Thanks.
Donna Summer was marketed as the first lady of lust in the 70s. It was very overt. They were very conscious of the erotic aspect of disco and of dance music and used that to sell records, and it worked. What Saturday Night Fever did for disco was precisely what Elvis Presley did for rock and roll. There were black musicians making rock and roll for years, and suddenly you put a white face on it and it became the hottest thing in the world. And the same thing happened with disco. What I discovered in exploring disco and what it meant to people in the 70s, that it was all about providing a happy escape from the hard times of their lives. And so I think that coming out of my experience of loss and seeing illness in so many people that I loved, that disco reminded me that there are happy times to be found in the midst of hard times, and that we can celebrate life.
John-Manuel Andriote continues to write and speak about AIDS. He offers a positive message about hope and healing, and celebrating life's good times even in the face of hard times.
We must keep alive the legacy of the first generations of people with AIDS who showed the way to live with pride and dignity, even in the face of what for them was a terribly disfiguring and invariably fatal illness. Bobby Campbell, the first person with AIDS ever to be public about his illness, used to wear a button that said simply, "Survive." That really summed it all up. We all want to survive, to live, because we are programmed to live. People living with HIV/AIDS continue to show us how to live. Let's continue to share what we learned from our forefathers 2 decades ago. Let's continue to tell their and our own stories. Let's keep changing the world with our stories, with our wisdom, our power, our lives of honesty and integrity, our love for each other, and our love of life.